Peter Geoghegan from the Democracy for Sale newsletter joins me now. It's always exciting to have Peter in the studio, and it usually means that we're turning our attention towards Tufton Street or the congregation of opaque entities that centre on that street in Westminster. Before we get into your latest work, a couple of requests for an idiot's guide to Tufton Street.
Of course. What is it? Well, essentially, Tufton Street is like a shorthand for a kind of constellation of what you could call right-wing campaign groups, pressure groups, self-described think tanks that are located. Some of them are in a building called 55 Tufton Street, which is a very nice street in central London. I have to say it's a very nice address. And some are next door in 57 Tufton Street. Some of them are in other streets, other locations in and around it. There are groups like the Institute of Economic Affairs, who we've discussed on this programme in the past. Groups like the Centre for Policy Studies. Some of these are groups that have existed for a very long time, very much on the right of British politics, were very influential actually during the years with Margaret Thatcher, had largely disappeared in some respects. Brexit reanimated a lot of them, and it's fair to say they were very, very much in the tank for Liz Truss, quite a lot of them. Really, really, the ideas behind Liz Truss, which frankly didn't go all so well. But one of the reasons I've been interested in so much is is to get a lot of access. You'll often hear these guys in the media. They sound like they're very independent. The Institute of Economic Affairs, for example, sounds very independent, sounds like the Institute of Fiscal Studies. But actually, these people don't declare their donors, they don't say where their money is, and they've got really, really strong links with the Conservative Party, which I think a lot of people in this country wouldn't know when they first encounter them.
It sometimes might be called a free market think tank, for example, which is a fairly cuddly term in some ways. And yet we talk a lot about the anonymity of the donors and the opaqueness of the funding, but the stories you are here to talk to us about involve the identities of donors.
Yeah, well,
There's two stories, isn't there? We've got the one that Rishi Sunak likes to present himself as very different from Liz Truss, is the first line of one of the stories, and the other looks at how many or how much identified Conservative donors have pumped into these so-called think tanks. Which one do you want to start with?
Well, let's start with today's one, which is all about how who's actually funding these think tanks, which is we were able to discover using documents, kind of a lot of trawling through returns, charitable returns, and some FOI work as well, to find out some of these people, because we don't know who they are. And it turns out, interestingly, these groups have actually had a lot of money, almost £7 million in the last 5 years, from Conservative donors. And this is a lot for these organisations. They have an annual turnover of £2.5-3 million, the biggest ones. This is a huge chunk of money. And what's fascinating, I think, about that is you have people, these are people who are big Tory donors, people like Michael Hinsa, Lord Michael Hinsa, a number of people in the House of Lords, four Lords. Lord Vincent gave the IEA an investment of almost £4 million. So this is big chunks of money. And what's fascinating about this is these are also people who donate to the Conservative Party. So at what point does the Conservative Party end and Tufton Street begin if both organisations are being bankrolled by the same people?
And it's interesting for a number of reasons, but not least because if I'm watching Question Time, I'll see representatives of these organisations as almost in the independent chair, because there'll be a Tory MP there and there'll be a Labour MP there, and then there'll be someone from a quotes think tank, end quotes, on the end of the panel, whereas, as you're pointing out, they couldn't be more intertwined really with the Conservative Party. So I knew about the personnel. I know about people moving from Tufton Street into the Conservative Party high command with, almost like a revolving door. I think Sunak's current director of communications was involved in the IEA's last attempt to silence you and me, but we can all remember how well that went for them. But you're going beyond the personnel and you're looking at where the cash actually came from. £6.8 million of it. And it could be a coincidence. You could be both a Conservative donor and, for balance, giving all of this money to a Tufton Street operation. But it seems unlikely.
Well, what's interesting as well, James, is in the story that we did yesterday, we started looking at, who actually runs these Tufton Street organisations? So you've got the people you see and I see that go into the comms jobs. And if you look at this world like we do, we will see someone who one day is working for a Tufton Street outlet, Then they go into government. They might even become an MP. They will have a conveyor belt. It's basically been a conveyor belt over the last 15 years. But what was really interesting as we started looking at, well, who runs these? Who are the actual trustees? Who are the directors? Who signs the documents? And if you look across the piece, it's a humongous amount of Tory donors. We found more than £35 million given from directors, trustees and advisors of Tufton Street organisations to the Tory party. Look at, say, the Centre for Policy Studies, which was set up by Keith Joseph, who was very much the architect of Margaret Thatcher. The chair of the board at the Centre for Policy Studies is Lord Michael Spencer, who's given more than £7 million to the Tories.
We should stress that it describes itself as independent and non-partisan. My late father would say it says Daz on the side of buses, but it doesn't mean they sell it inside.
Indeed. So what's interesting is you've got these big Tory donors, Anthony Bamford, all the rest of it. We worked out that they've given this £35 million to the Tory party. Some of these think tanks, actually, Centre for Policy Studies isn't one of them. They say they're independent, non-partisan. Other think tanks are actually charities where they actually have a duty to consult with all major political parties.
Educational charities.
And how much money have they given to other political parties? 65 grand to the Lib Dems and not a penny to Labour, these donors.
Diddly squat to the Labour Party. And you're looking at the way in which, in some ways, Sunak is being funded by precisely the same people that inspired Liz Truss's disastrous mini-budget.
Well, this is really striking if you look at it. It surprised me because you have Sunak's language as Truss was wrong, I'm a new face. Once Rishi Sunak got into power, he made a new treasurer of the Tory party, which is often what you do when you want to raise money. Who did he make as a treasurer? A guy called Graham Edwards, who runs a water company, amongst other things. But he was also a donor to Liz Truss, gave £50,000 to Liz Truss's campaign, is on the board of the Centre for Policy Studies, so was very clearly behind Liz Truss. If you think Liz Truss was so bad, would you make one of her donors your new right-hand man? Graham Edwards has raised almost £50 million for the Tories. He's also given over £4 million to Sunak.
How much of that came from Frank Hester?
A huge chunk.
Almost all of it.
Yeah. Almost all of it. If you, between the
Sorry, I misspoke there. From the racist businessman Frank Hester.
Between these the directors that we're looking at and Frank Hester, you're talking about almost half of all the money the Tory party have taken in under Rishi Sunak.
It explains why they can't give it back, doesn't it? Really.
Well, they need it.
Perhaps one of the reasons why they're not giving it back. The other might be that they're not as disgusted by his racist abuse of Diane Abbott as the rest of us are. And I mean, I've got to be honest with you, Peter. I always enjoy your work, but I wasn't expecting to come across a former Russian arms tycoon in your latest dispatch.
Well, that refers to a guy called Alexander Temerko, who Reuters described as that in a story a couple of years ago, talking about how close he was to Boris Johnson. Alexander Temerko is he's an advisor to the Institute of Economic Affairs. He's given over £1 million through both personally and through a company called Aquind to the Tory party. And again, he was someone who was very supportive of Liz Truss and is now bankrolling Rishi Sunak. Has given over almost £100,000 since Rishi Sunak became the Prime Minister. And I think it gives you some idea of these kind of how this small group, what we really are talking about here, James, is a small group of very wealthy people with frankly very specific political ideologies that very much benefit them financially. It's all a lot of the time about low tax, which benefits them, who are, as we've discovered, really bankrolling these influential Tufton Street outlets, bankrolling the Tories. And when you see these guys on TV, and as you say, they're on a political panel show, and you've got someone from the IEA next to somebody from the Conservative Party, at what point do you actually have to say, well, these are actually two sides of the same coin?
Since 2020, these think tanks have met government ministers more than 150 times, with the Centre for Policy Studies meeting ministers on 64 separate occasions, more than we think any other. Well, you think yours is your work, which you've done in conjunction this time, haven't you, with the Mirror and the I keep calling them Drop the Dead Donkeys, but it's the Led by Donkeys pressure group organisation. It's a collaboration, and you're also looking at the frequency upon which they appear in the UK media, the Telegraph being Tufton Street's biggest booster, followed by the Murdoch-owned Times, and then the Mail. Of course, BBC and indeed LBC would be on that list as well. It sometimes feels like you can't turn on your TV or your radio without hearing from one of them. And something that's not in your coverage today, but something I noticed yesterday, is that Matthew Elliott, who of course set up the Taxpayers Alliance and went on to be the head of Vote Leave, turned up at a Trump fundraiser in London last night.
Yes, and Matthew Elliott's wife is still, I think, the chair of Republicans overseas abroad in the UK. And we have this, and I think we're going to see, that's one of the aspects I think we're going to see post-election, is we've seen these growing. We've actually got some more stories to come on the links between Tufton Street and the American right as well. So tune in the coming days for that, James.
Look at that. He's getting the hang of it, isn't he?